Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 20 of Series 8. And the question for today is, can a structural perspective explain consciousness and resolve its problems? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 2. So in recent weeks, we have discussed the character of consciousness and its various aspects in terms of structure. Standard structures are those of intentionality, temporality, and unity or divisibility. And I have added structures like graduation, insularity, ephemerality, and insubstantiality. Today, I want to show how structures explain consciousness, its problems, and solutions. In my view, human beings must be defined in terms of consciousness rather than as biological or social beings. This is evident in the development of pre-reflective animal consciousness to reflective human consciousness. Reflective consciousness is also a precondition of essentially human features like moral choice, self-monitoring, free will, and the capacities of reason and abstraction. Therefore, to define human beings at the most fundamental level and to characterize the deepest human problems and to resolve them at that level, we must approach humanity in terms of consciousness. My method of doing this is to employ phenomenology and its idea of structures of consciousness. Conversely, classical theories of mind include neurology, the unconscious, archetypes, and the ego, id, and the alter ego. These are very useful, but they aren't describing mind or consciousness explicitly or fundamentally. And other theories like physicalism, functionalism, and behaviorism don't describe mind at all. But a structural perspective gives coherence and unification to an otherwise amorphous concept of mind. This is because all states of mind, cognition, affect, will, and value, are all subject to these structures. And structural explanations are applicable to so many aspects of consciousness as we have seen. So today I will run through these structures, explaining them and their applications. Yet I want to start with the most difficult and fundamental problem of consciousness that are described as insubstantiality. Sartre describes this condition in a relation between conscious being for itself and physical being in itself. On his view, physicality has impregnable being which cannot be deformed, reduced, or threatened. Yet a contingent and ephemeral consciousness seeks the permanence in itself of physicality. But this project is impossible. Hence Sartre describes mankind as a useless passion. But I replace physicality with a more realistic objective of values sufficiency. The point here, however, is to explain the most fundamental problem of consciousness in terms of insubstantiality. And insubstantiality can be explained with the further structures of temporality, divisibility, and graduation. Temporality produces impermanence, change, choice, responsibility, and anxiety. Divisibility creates problems like personal fragmentation, internal conflicts, and alienation. Graduation means that we not only develop but also diminish and eventually die. Yet we will discuss these structures again shortly. But I first want to explain how and why structures are existentially significant for lived human existence. It's because structures aren't just abstract features, but represent relations and states of consciousness. Structures are the frameworks or vessels which extrude mental states, and those mental states are supervenient on structures of consciousness. That is, structures are the vehicles or crucibles of cognition, affect, feeling, will and value. They contour our character, how we experience ourselves, and our concern about what we are. So on this view, structures aren't just concepts with which to understand consciousness. They are the fabric of consciousness, which constitutes the character of our thoughts, feelings and values. And as I have previously argued, problems must be resolved in terms of affect, feeling and value. Cognition, affect, will and even consciousness itself can't ultimately resolve the problems of consciousness. The solution must be found in terms of value, that is, a sufficiency or sufficiencies of value. These sufficiencies of value, like love, self-esteem and other undiscovered values. But there also are arguments against a structural approach that we need to outline. Colin McGinn, for example, holds that consciousness is too thin or insubstantial to have structures. But whether consciousness is explicable in terms of structures is subject to the following arguments. And last week we saw that this rejection of mental graduation didn't hold water. But postmodernism is also a post-structuralism that rejects structures of mind or of practically any kind. Yet postmodernism primarily rejects the universal structures that cannot underlie the whole of human life, and they direct their attention to the social and psychological structures such as of Marx and Freud. Yet phenomenologists are instead talking about structures of consciousness, not of psychology or society. And postmodernism has physicalist inclinations as well as ruling out a coherent concept of consciousness. So the physicalism of postmodernism cannot allow itself to consider structures of consciousness. And in light of denials of consciousness, we can reiterate a basic argument for a structural approach to consciousness. Firstly, that consciousness exists. Secondly, because it exists, it must have properties. Thirdly, our arguments show that those properties are best described as structures. So we need to get on with the explication of structures, and we should start with the seminal structure of intentionality. Intentionality was introduced by Brentano, is widely used, but not to be confused with motivational intent. Intentionality is a mental process with relations to external mental or physical objects. Brentano wanted to make intentionality a general feature of all mental states. But some states, like pain and pleasure, don't necessarily intend towards cognitive mental objects. Yet Husserl and Heidegger preferred the word directedness to intentionality. This could imply a process like an ocean current rather than a river going to an object. And this is one argument for intentionality as a general feature of all mental states. Brentano's student, Kazimierz Twardowski, also distinguished between the content and the object of a presentation. Intentionality thereby has intentional or phenomenal content, often directed towards mental objects. And both the quality of internal content and the mental object are important to phenomenologists as well as to us. To illustrate, we can take Georges Bataille's metaphor of mind as water in a bottle, for us liquid in a container. And the liquid can represent mental states of different viscosities independence or substantiality. The thicker the liquid or mental state, the more independent it is of external frameworks. Water will flow all over the place. Hardened cement won't need external framework at all. In the case I want to present, the mental states are value states and their external objects are cognitive objects. Greater independence or sufficiency of value would be states like self-esteem, maturity and ethical fortitude. And we can intuitively see a preference here for an independence or sufficiency of value. Yet this is a picture of structural relations between objects, values and values sufficiencies. I now want to turn to divisibility as a structure that is both a problem and a precondition of value that is a solution to those problems. I regard divisibility as a broad structure having an application across the whole spectrum of mind. That is, from explaining perception to the separateness of individuals to modalities of mind and to value. That is, divisibility even applies to people as individual consciousnesses not accepted by some classical views. For Schopenhauer and Feuerbach, consciousness doesn't depend on individuals, they only participate in it. But Bernard Williams and others regard individuals' separateness as a premise of modern thought. Also following Saussure, Wittgenstein and others, divisibility as a form of contrast is essential to perception. That is, all perceptions entail contrast as divisibility within themselves and with what they are not. Contrast is essential to perception. For example, a white spot on a white board is not a spot at all. Yet divisibility also crucially applies to the individual mind or consciousness in many ways. For example, in split brains and minds, in schizophrenia, in modes of consciousness and the unconscious and affect or cognition. A modular model of mind is divided in various ways, and that is offered by Jerry Fodor and others. Other divisions include cognitive dissidence, compartmentalizations, bipolar events and split brains. And these various ways in which mind is divided present a problem for the human condition. The opposite unity view is held in religion and by Descartes, Locke, Kant and moderns like Searle and Tim Bain. Yet in one sense there is a unity of mind in having a personal identity and in the amalgam that is consciousness. All those divisions happen in a single organism, in a single timeline that I identify as myself. My thoughts aren't in one place, my feelings in another, and my volitions elsewhere. Yet radical divisibility of consciousness is nevertheless a fact of human existence, and divisibility is also at the root and foundation of value and values. 2 weeks ago I presented the origins of value in divisibility, contrast and tension with the help of phenomenologists. These phenomenologists were Nietzsche, Husserl, Heidegger and Sartre. Yet I need to repeat what I said again here. That is, phenomenologists make a close identification between consciousness and value. Heidegger cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value, and that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. What is being said here is that value and consciousness are coexistent. And with Sartre, we find an even closer identification between consciousness, value, and choice as selection. He writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. That is, elimination and selection presuppose preference, which is an expression of value. Sartre also writes, choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. But in my view, choice as selection need not be a deliberated choice of reflective consciousness. That is, selection can also be a preconscious or an unconscious event in an underlying structure. But Sartre's ultra-phenomenological analysis cannot include such preconscious or unconscious events. This is because he rejects the idea of a graduated conception of consciousness. For example, he writes that it's impossible to conceive of consciousness to the degree to which it is not conscious of itself. For Sartre, consciousness is a plenum of existence because it is pure appearance. So it seems that Sartre can't actually trace selection, choice and value back to their ontological foundation. This is because he not only excludes the unconscious and preconscious from consciousness, he also rejects graduations of consciousness down to subtler and subtler levels. I previously argued the case for a graduated conception of consciousness that I can't repeat here, but I can note some thinkers who take this graduated view, such as Darwin, Bernard Williams, Jean Piaget, H. Price, John Eccles and Teilhard de Chardin. And the graduation of consciousness enables us to trace the origins of selection and value back to its emergence. And we can continue to say that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are the kind of selections that are essential to epistemic contrasts and perceptions as well as to value. For example, a white spot on a whiteboard can't be seen. It needs a contrast. And such contrasts, divisions and tensions in the world are mirrored in the origins of value. We previously saw Nietzsche explain an emergence of value in the tensions of conscience. But we have considered at least two objections that can be made to this kind of explanation of the origins of value. One, they are not the values we need of motivation, morals, meaning or purpose. And two, values also emerge from social and biological sources without selection or choice. In response to social or biological values, such must be experienced in consciousness in order to be values. That is, social or biological explanations are reductionist and need a further level of explanation. For example, an automatic propensity to action is not a value. Such are only latent or potential values. They only become values on selection as preferences of mental states. Yet animals are conscious creatures who can have values but not moral values. In response to the first criticism above of explaining only trivial values, we can make a couple of replies. Firstly, that we are explaining the origins of incipient values, not the later motivational and moral values. And secondly, we can take this phenomenological analysis further with the structure of temporality. That is, Martin Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Edmund Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and a flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. On this view, time is posited as a necessary precondition of consciousness and thereby also of value. Kant's Copernican revolution goes so far as to regard both space and time as produced by consciousness. But we don't need to go so far to make a transition from the world to consciousness and value. Yet we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through the diversity in space. Judgments of value must be continually produced to cope with the flow of consciousness. I look to my left and see a window. I look to my right and see a door. I choose to walk through the door. Outside, I find someone lying on the floor. What do? Help, walk past, or ignore the person? Now I need recourse to an ethics of value as a development of incipient value. Yet the above shows how divisibility is both a problem and a solution in terms of value. Temporality and graduation will also seem to have both these functions. Last week we discussed graduation exclusively as a structure of consciousness. We discussed graduation of various mental states and more controversially as a property of consciousness. Some mental states like belief and happiness are generally accepted as subject to graduation, but others like free will, moral values, reason and facts of science are more debatable. I won't go over the debate again. But we can reiterate disagreement over whether consciousness as a whole is subject to graduation. Tim Bain, Colin McGinn and others believe that the emergence of consciousness is sudden and immediate. But others, like John Eccles and Bernard Williams, disagree with this all or nothing view of mind. Some clarification was found by differentiating mind, consciousness, awareness and the fact of their existence. The case for the graduation of mind was secured by species evolution and individual growth in life. The case for the graduation of consciousness and awareness was made by distinguishing them from the fact of their existence. This argument was supported by a general lack of understanding of consciousness, and that lack of understanding was itself found to be a structural feature of consciousness. That is, graduation is a primary cause of the neglect, obfuscation and self-obfuscation of consciousness. Numerous other explanations are available of this problem of understanding and obfuscation. These are such as a lack of language, concepts and immediate observability of consciousness. I've also noted the problems of insularity and attenuated cognition that I will reiterate shortly. My general presentation of the problem is a phenomenological account of what I call an error theory of consciousness. Error theory denotes the pervasive yet neglected tendency of self-consciousness to forget itself. It tends to regress into the pre-conscious, to overlook its attributes and even its own existence. My argument for obfuscation and self-obfuscation from regression proceeds in the following way. To begin with, consciousness expresses different characteristics at different levels. Pre-reflective, or typically animal consciousness, is not explicitly aware of its own existence. Human consciousness typically has such capacities as personal identity and is self-aware. But reflective consciousness isn't fixed, guaranteed by God or by Sartrean claims of impossibility. It is a product of neurology and other factors like relations with the external world. And consciousness is subject to loss of capacities in weakness, sleep, senility, coma, and eventual cessation in death. That is, the relatively new and fragile capacity of self-consciousness is subject to regression into earlier states, and earlier states of consciousness lack self-consciousness. Goethe describes this tendency to regress into more primitive states in the following way. Man cannot persist long in a conscious state. He must throw himself back into the unconscious, for his root lives there. Unquote. A related account of this obfuscation was also explained by the graduation of what I called attenuated cognition. That is, standard perception involves contrast and reference to a background of understanding. But self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. That is, I am a conscious being that can't be easily compared to physical objects, and I have an immediate experience of myself that I don't have of other people. This amounts to a graduated and attenuated form of cognition. An illustrative example of attenuated cognition can be found in the mysteriousness of consciousness. We can compare this mysteriousness with the mysteriousness of other objects. Freud, Russell and Wittgenstein, for example, described mysticism variously as a sense of oneness with the universe, interrelatedness, and feeling the world as a limited whole. Other mysterious objects are God, being, the universe, and flying saucers. What these have in common is an attenuated background of understanding. I also want to briefly reiterate an application of attenuated cognition to moral and value judgments. That is, as a graduated cognitive framework employed as a moral criterion in different degrees of support. The earlier metaphor of Bataille's mind as water in a bottle serves to illustrate the idea. In this view, moral fortitude and independence is the idea that unwarranted cognitive support isn't desirable. I define moral fortitude here as doing the right thing without or with limited social or cognitive support. And I describe this as attenuated cognition in its degrees of cognitive support or absence. That is a different way of looking at moral judgments than traditional criteria. And it's also an attenuated cognition that is a form of graduated consciousness. I have also previously characterized consciousness with a structure that I describe as insularity. It is the fact that individuals are ontologically isolated from each other. This means that we don't have immediate access to other people's thoughts and experiences, and it contrasts with the Vedantic view shared by Schopenhauer and Feuerbach that we only participate in the same shared consciousness rejected by most modern thought. Insularity thereby describes an aspect of self-consciousness that is a form of epistemological solipsism. This excludes the kind of mystical relations that are often appealed to in ethical relations between people. The argument for this view is that there is no evidence for such mystical relations, and that human relations can only be explained cognitively, emotionally, or empirically. Yet this also results in a form of attenuated cognition as above. This is because I can compare myself to physical objects, but these are not the objects of the same type as myself. I can compare or contrast myself to other conscious beings, but not in the same way as myself. This is because I apprehend myself directly in a way that I don't apprehend others. So the objective in this workshop has been to explicate consciousness, its problems and solutions in terms of structure. I described the main existential problem of consciousness with the structural concept of insubstantiality, and I explained insubstantiality with the structures of temporality, divisibility and graduation. Yet these structures are also preconditions of value which offers a solution to their problems. The structure of graduation similarly produced an epistemological problem, an explanation and a solution. The existential problem produced by graduation is that we decline and die. Yet graduation provides solutions both in its role in producing value and its increasing capacities of reason and reflection to resolve the problems at hand. Yet more intriguingly, we saw how graduation explained regression and the self-obfuscation of consciousness. We saw how attenuated cognition explained both the mysteriousness of consciousness and moral fortitude, and that insularity produces attenuated cognition, non-referentiality and self-obfuscation. Yet perhaps a key advantage of a structural account over others is its explicit account of consciousness. That is, other classical accounts may be revelatory, but are largely functional, explaining how, not what. A structural account also gives coherence and unification to an otherwise amorphous concept of mind. This is because all states of mind, cognition, affect, will and value, are subject to these structures, and structural explanations are applicable to so many aspects of consciousness, and we have discussed many of these in previous weeks as well as today. These have included mathematics, free will, mysteriousness and value. Next week we'll look at how structure can help us explain the origins of consciousness. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.